Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Alright, today we are getting into this guy, Watsuji Tetsuro, and his book Ethics, Rinrigaku. Just before we do, maybe a quick note on how I envisage this series going. I'm not going to do as detailed a breakdown of ethics as I've done in the past with people like Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty and those kinds of guys. A couple of reasons. One, although very valuable and although it addresses something which other authors that I've talked about kind of don't go into in as much detail, ethics and that kind of intersubjectivity, our relations with others, although kind of broached in various different ways by those other philosophers, I think Watsuji has something original and something interesting to add here. But it's not, the book itself isn't quite as foundational as those other texts, being in nothingness, being in time, phenomenology of perception. Those are really core texts, I think, for anybody interested in phenomenology or existentialism or even philosophy in general. So they really warranted a solid, almost page by page analysis. And that was what I wanted for myself as well, to really understand those books kind of through and through. And this is not quite at that same level. It's not as foundational as those texts. So we won't be going through in that kind of detail. Also, secondly, he's quite readable. So, I definitely encourage you to get a copy and read it yourself. But it's not a dense read. It's not like, it's not going to take you an hour to read like 15 pages with multiple rereadings and like, going back a few pages every 5 minutes to try and understand something that you passed over in complete confusion 5 minutes ago. It's very readable. It doesn't kind of require that kind of it doesn't require the same level of explanation that I think though some of those other philosophers did require. So yeah, that's just how I'm going to approach this. But we still will be going through the book from kind of following Watsuji's structure, going from the first chapter right through to the last one. So we'll start with the first chapter, which he calls the significance of ethics as the study of ningen. I am just going to gloss that to key concepts. So in this, from the first chapter, there are basically four concepts that I want to pull out and talk about in a little bit of detail, because I think they're core to understanding ethics. So the first is in-betweenness. And although we talked about this in the last video, we didn't use the word itself. All in-betweenness means is the social aspect of a human being. The fact that we are always together with. So it's a fundamental part of what it is to be a human being, is to be with other people. And other philosophers that I've talked about on this channel have mentioned that as well. But Watsuji makes it the foundation of his ethics in a way that, like I said, I don't think other commentators have done. Not commentators, other philosophers have done. So we're always together with, that's our original starting position, and that will inform the ethics that Watsuji develops. And of course, we can contrast this with the typical Western approach in philosophy to philosophy, which is to focus on the individual primarily. And even though people like Heidegger, Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, they all referred to this idea that being with other people is an existential, is a foundational element in what it is to be a human being, they didn't really follow that through. They still, it was more kind of to the side. It was more this kind of a part of us, sure, but nothing really followed from it. Watsuji's kind of filling in that gap. And that's to say where this was even included, because usually the relations with other people, community, that is more like an add-on. The individual is treated as primary. An individual kind of atomic unit is what we start from. An ego or consciousness or a mind. That's the self. That's the starting point. And then we add on these other things as kind of things that are more ancillary, relations with other people, ethics. These things get added on almost as afterthoughts. Not as afterthoughts, but certainly as derivative, certainly as secondary to the primary unit, which is the self. Watsuji is completely reversing that, and the word that expresses this is in-betweenness. The second word is act connections. And so this refers to the connections in betweenness, the kind of the glue, the bond that holds in-betweenness together, that makes it work. The way that we relate to other people in this together with of in-betweenness. And importantly here, so this is not objective. So Watsuji is not approaching act connections through the lens of a subject-object distinction. So you can think straight away, think of Sartre with this, where his whole philosophy of our relations with others was conflict-based. It was all about the subject-object and the conflict in trying to establish oneself as a subject over the other as an object. But that's exactly the opposite of what Watsuji's doing here. It's not subject-object oriented, but it's concerned with communication or association, words that bring to mind a kind of an inclusiveness that is kind of missing in Sartre's relations with others. So act connections, these are the things that hold together in betweenness. And also just note their act, the importance of that word. This is a dynamic kind of process which holds in betweenness together. And that's going to be important for Watsuji throughout the whole book. The third word is Rinri, which means ethics. It's in the title, right? Rinrigaku. And the definition of this is the order or the pattern through which the communal existence of human beings is rendered possible. The laws of social existence. So worth maybe just saying a little bit about this. Ethics for Watsuji is not something that is kind of imposed on the individual from outside. That again is already thinking of us as individuals primarily, who then need to negotiate this world in which we find ourselves with other people. That's the opposite of Watsuji's approach. He's starting with the individual. So he's starting with the individual, but the individual in community. So his ethics follows from that. It's the laws of social existence, but not as dictated to us or imposed on us by other people or by the state or the government or even by reason. His ethics comes from the fact that we are essentially, intrinsically societal, that we are in-betweenness, that this makes up the core of what it is to be a human being. So his ethics flows from his conception of what it is to be a human being, what a human being fundamentally is. And I find that really a really good way to approach ethics, as opposed to the typical Western ideas of ethics, which, the deontological approach, here's a list of things, do this, don't do that, or utilitarianism, these kinds of maxims or formulas that you can apply to any situation. They seem very simplistic and very externally based. They're, like I said, they're things that we impose on ourselves in order to facilitate peaceful relationships, to facilitate cohabitation with other people, with other humans. But it's just a little bit too external. I can't think of any other words, but what Watsuji does, he kind of brings ethics and makes it a part of the human being, makes it a part of what it is to be a human being. So what we won't get from Watsuji in this book is a list of things to do or not to do, or a formula to apply, to figure out, to calculate the right thing to do. That's not what ethics is for Watsuji. It's more closely intertwined with what it is to be a human being. And I think that gets to something which is deeper than these kind of more superficial, I think, approaches that Western philosophy has typically had to ethics. And the last word is ningen, which means human being, but human being in the sense that it incorporates the dual characteristics of humans as individuals and as members of society. So Watsuji is not denying that we are individuals, but we are members of a society at the same time. We are individuals in society, and it's the idea that the individual is not primary, that is kind of crucial for Watsuji. Being in society is the primary reality that Watsuji wants to emphasize, although of course we are individuals, but there's this in-betweenness that is more foundational. Individuals are basically different from society and yet dissolve themselves into society. Ningen denotes the unity of these contradictories. So that's what Watsuji means when he says ningen. He talks about it a lot. He uses that word a lot in the book. So if you're reading through, that's what he's referring to there. This kind of fundamentally, these dual characteristics that make up the human being. So those are the key concepts, and which means we can just move into the second chapter, which is method. So the method that Watsuji is talking about here is the method he's going to use to investigate the human being, what it is to be a human being. So like I said, his ethics flows from an understanding of what human beings are, what it is, the fundamental structure of a human being. So that's going to be core for Watsuji, is to understand what it is to be a human being before we can even think about ethics, how that enters into this. So the method that he's going to follow or for the method that he's going to follow, there are two things that are essential to keep in mind. The first is that community is primary. So this is just that idea of in-betweenness. That's essential, not in a way that, not essential in the sense that it's important, but essential in the sense that it's the essence of a human being. To be together with. It's the primary, originary, fundamental place from which the human being can kind of begin to exist. That's the starting point. There's no such thing as an isolated individual separate from society. Here's a nice example of this to back up this idea, actually. He talks about someone we might consider to have completely cut themselves off from society, someone who's locked themselves away and is writing for themselves. Someone like, imagine Descartes. That's the old story about Descartes. He locked himself in a room and it was decided that he wasn't going to come out until he had until he had something solid to build on, some solid foundation. So he's just writing for himself, by himself, completely isolated from society. This person we might imagine has completely removed themselves from this wider influence. But Watsuji says, let's think about this a little bit more carefully. This person is writing for someone. Usually when we write with the idea that someone's going to read what we've written. So there's the idea of an audience, right? But even if you're writing for yourself, even if you're just trying to clarify your own ideas, even if you're going to burn your writing as soon as you finish it, when you're writing, you're still writing with an imaginary reader in mind. You're writing in a way that someone else could understand, could read and understand what you're writing. So even if you never plan to for anyone else to read this, even if, like I say, you're burning it as you're writing it, so it's completely impossible for anyone to read it, you're still writing with this notion of someone, an imaginary reader reading what you're writing. But even if we forget all of that, just think about the act of writing itself. You're writing using language. Language is something you've inherited from a broader community, something that's evolved over centuries and has made its way to you. All of the words that you're using reflect that community influence. The structure of what you're writing. Perhaps you're writing in chapters. You've got headings. You've got paragraphs. You've got all of these conventions, punctuation. All of this stuff is an influence from the community. The idea is that there's nothing you can do that would make you a completely isolated, separate individual. From the very beginning, you are embedded, enmeshed in society. In-betweenness, that's that idea. And so this is the first thing that's important to remember for Watsuji's method. Here he also talks about this interesting kind of contradiction, unity, division, union nature of in-betweenness. And so this is the idea, he says, that betweenness consists in a separated self and an other becoming unified. But in order to talk of separation at all, there must have been some original unity, right? Or else the word separation doesn't even make sense, doesn't mean anything. But in order to talk of unity, of being unified, there must be an absolute separation. Or there's no, again, the word unification doesn't mean anything. So we have kind of this chicken and egg paradox, which we referred to before with ningen, that word human being, those dual characteristics, humans as individuals and yet at the same time as members of a society. So we have this kind of, as just something to keep in the back of your mind. We will address this. It seems like it might be a real problem, but we'll address this in the next couple of videos anyway, and hopefully resolve it. But yeah, just keep that in mind, this chicken and egg kind of paradox. How can there be a unity without an original separation, and how can there be a separation without an original unity? We'll come back to that. But that's just kind of connected with this idea of in-betweenness, or community being primary. So the second thing that is important for Watsuji's method is the ground of our questioning will be the practical interconnection of acts. That is to say, those act connections we talked about in the first section. And what really comes to mind here, so in pursuing what it is to be a human being, what a human being is, Watsuji's looking at these act connections. So in-betweenness is fundamental, foundational, and a part of in-betweenness is these act connections. What makes in-betweenness function is these act connections. So we're going to have to question these. We're going to have to include these, investigate them in our study of what it is to be a human being. And there are a couple of things that are important here. The first is this is practical. So Watsuji is going to be concerned with our everyday interactions, the way that we act on a day-to-day basis with other people. That's going to lead us to an understanding of what it is to be a human being. And the second thing is the word act itself tells us that this is dynamic. It's a process. These relations between people are act-based. They're verbs, not static, theoretical, or conceptual contemplations of objects. So again, bringing that idea of dynamism to the forefront as what it is to be in betweenness. And so following this method then to understand the human being, we see that all our questioning about who or what the being of human beings is comes back to practical human relationships, i.e. it comes back to ethics. And that ties in with what I was saying earlier. For Watsuji, ethics is deeper than a set of rules imposed on us from outside or a formula. It concerns the very nature of what it is to be a human being. Contra, for example, people like Kant, and he talks about Kant in the book, in the second chapter, who realized ethics was practical, but he based his whole ethical project on the notion of the individual ego as an instance of universal reason. And so starting from that position, from the individual, he misses the key concept, the key idea of in-betweenness, which means that ethics is always then kind of, like I say, removed from us. There's always this kind of gap between us and ethics, which leaves, it just makes ethics something not intrinsic to us, non-essential, something we have to kind of, we have to attempt to force on ourselves or on other people. And that always gives me it's always given me a feeling of a kind of a disconnect between us and ethics that I think doesn't get to the heart of what ethics should be. And he also talks about phenomenology, which so this is, I guess, mainly Husserlian phenomenology, although I don't think he specifically says that. But phenomenology is essentially based on intentionality. But again, intentionality is missing this idea of in-betweenness. It's centered on the ego, the individual, the consciousness, the mind of a self, projecting out, looking at the world, how it perceives, how it remembers, how it intends other objects. So it's, again, from the very beginning, it's focused on the individual, missing the more fundamental, more originary nature of human beings as in-betweenness. And further, and this was kind of interesting, he talks about intentionality itself never becoming an object of intentionality. So in real community, for instance, the self and the other act on each other while at the same time being mutually determined by each other. And that's something that is certainly not drilled down on in Husserl, and although it is broached by, particularly I'm thinking of Sartre and Merleau-Ponty, nothing really comes of it in terms of its relations with, in terms of how it impacts our relations with others. Let me give you a quote and then discuss that in a bit more detail. In the betweenness, one's activity of seeing is a seeing determined, conversely, by its being seen by the other. So that's quite kind of a nice idea, I think, that is kind of missed by just thinking about phenomenology as intentionality. Our seeing is always a seeing that has been influenced by and is continually being influenced by what is being seen. And I mentioned Sartre and Merleau-Ponty. That comes up obviously in Sartre with the look, the way that, I always remember that passage where he talks about peeping through a keyhole and the idea of someone seeing you and you're just kind of like reduced to this object, like a deer in headlights. Someone's just nailed you, caught you red-handed. But that idea of being seen by the other. And Merleau-Ponty as well, where, although less with other people and more with the world. I was just reading an article about Merleau-Ponty where the guy talks about the fact that for Merleau-Ponty we are fundamentally in the world, meaning that we are not just spectators of it, but we are continually being influenced by, shaped by, molded by that world. So there's this inescapable relation we have with the world itself, which is informing our own perspective on that world. So there's this real kind of feedback loop, if you like, which is really nice. But in Merleau-Ponty, it's about the world itself. It kind of, he doesn't carry that through, I don't think, into our relations with others. And for Sartre, although he does talk about the look and being seen by others, it gets cashed out as in a conflict-based model. Whereas for Watsuji, he's emphasizing this notion of betweenness as a more kind of collaborative or inclusive idea. But I quite like that notion of intentionality becoming the object of intentionality. So, okay, kind of some opposite ideas there with looking at Kant and phenomenology. And finally, Watsuji talks about hermeneutics, and he says that his method is hermeneutical in nature. But what you probably are thinking of when you think of hermeneutics is maybe interpretation. Watsuji has I guess similar but kind of a different way of defining hermeneutics. So for him, a method is hermeneutical when it tries to understand something subjective with the aid of expressions. So basically it's the attempt to transform the subject into a scientific object using expressions which cannot directly be submitted to scientific treatment themselves as objects. So it's kind of like being forced to use the wrong tool for the job. So the only way we can talk about a subject is with language, with expressions, but these expressions themselves are not precise in the way that science demands of them, in the way that a clear, rigorous analysis of something would require. And, if you think about using language, it's notoriously ambiguous, right? It's always open to other interpretations, or it's always open to a number of different interpretations. And often when I'm writing, a lot of my time is spent trying to close those doors to misunderstandings. I'm just trying to really lock the reader into my train of thought and prevent these other, usually with kind of spurious wanderings into mystical territory that often is kind of like always lurking at the edges of what I'm writing about, the temptation or the tendency to interpret it as some kind of mystical, or overlay some kind of supernatural interpretation on it. And that's just a part of what it is to use language, is that it's imprecise, it's ambiguous, and so we're forced to use these objects to try and clarify something, which to clarify the subject, to try and bring some order to what the human being is. But the things that we're using to do that they're not precise in the way that we would like them to be, perhaps, or that we would need if we were going to make something an object in the terms of that science likes to deal with, kind of rigorous, analytical, clear. And here very much one gets the impression of thinking of Husserl, for whom phenomenology was a science every bit as rigorous and analytical and precise as any of the other sciences, physics, chemistry, whatever. That was it was how he envisaged phenomenology. And that's kind of the key distinction too between him and the Heideggerian kind of philosophers who came after him. They weren't trying to make a science that could stand on equal footing with other sciences. They were clear that was never an option. And you just get the feel here, some of the language that Watsuji's using, he has that in mind, trying to turn the subject, the human being, into this kind of a precise, well-defined scientific object. But we're using language, we're using expressions to do this, and the tools are not well suited to this task. So what he's trying to do then with his hermeneutical method is to go beyond the explicit, conscious, theoretical understanding, and focus then on our pre-conscious, our implicit, our pre-theoretical reactions and our actions in social situations. So before becoming conscious of something, we've already put ourselves into action. And this is exactly what Sartre is probably most famous for doing when he talks about non-thetic, the way that we are fundamentally, the way that we live our lives rather than reflect on them. We spend all of our time living engaged in being a human being rather than contemplating or reflecting on the things that we're doing as human beings. And it's that more fundamental capacity that we have, or that more fundamental mode of engagement with the world that Sartre was always trying to capture, the pre-thetic, as opposed to the reflective, which comes along afterwards and kind of breaks down and analyzes. But the good stuff's already happened. We've already done the action. It's while we weren't thinking about it. It's while we hadn't reduced it to a reflective, cognitive activity that the action was carried out. And so that's what Watsuji's trying to capture with this hermeneutical method. So for him then, understanding, the word understanding, has a practical, non-intellectual connotation, as opposed to thinking and logic. Thinking can only deal with the rational, but understanding, in this broadened sense of the word, can handle the irrational, because it doesn't confine itself to the net of conceptual thought. It's pre-conceptual thought. It's non-thetic. It's before we've reflected on something. And that is 100% Heidegger, who says exactly the same thing about exactly the same word, understanding. So for Heidegger as well, understanding was fundamentally practical. It was not related to this kind of reflective, rationalizing, rational, logical approach. So Heidegger through and through. And another thing he says about this hermeneutical method, he's going to, and we've mentioned it before, he's going to start by looking at everyday experiences, our everyday experiences in our daily lives, because these take us back to our existence as members of a society. These place us right in the middle. They get us to the core of in-betweenness. And again, totally 100% Heidegger there, starting with the everyday. And just as a note, I've written this down regarding hermeneutics. Our nature as in-betweenness is active in our everyday lives. It's prevalent in the things that we do, but we usually don't see it precisely because we are caught up in it. We're too immersed in it. We're too close to it to see it, to understand it. And so what Watsuji's attempting to do with his hermeneutical method is make this implicit reality explicit. And that takes place through basically three movements. The first is a reduction, in which we separate ourselves from our being or our nature so that we can see it clearly. And this, he says, is a purely negative movement. And reduction is, you can't say that without thinking of Husserl. So one would imagine that he is thinking of Husserl with this, but it's not the Husserlian reduction, I would say. It's more like, it's Merleau-Ponty actually. It's the reduction of Merleau-Ponty. Because I was thinking about this actually, the Husserlian reduction is kind of a stepping back. It's not even a stepping back, it's a pairing off of all things that are related to the natural world, to the natural position. So we're kind of cutting ourselves off from all of that stuff so that we can understand ourselves, what it is so we can understand the structures of conscious experience. That's what the reduction does for Husserl. pulls us back from the natural world so we can see what it is that we're doing when we are perceiving, or when we are remembering, or when we are intending, whatever it is. So we can analyze those structures without kind of the preconceptions that we might have through our lived engagement in the world. Whereas what Watsuji and Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger are doing is the same thing, stepping back from that immersion in the world, but so that we can see the immersion itself more clearly. So that's kind of the difference between the two. Husserl is stepping back from the world to see ourselves more clearly without the world, whereas Merleau-Ponty, Heidegger and co are stepping back from the world to see this object, to see ourselves as we were in the world more clearly. And that's how I kind of see the difference between those kind of approaches. And of course, Heidegger completely rejects the notion of the reduction. Merleau-Ponty accepts it, but with this caveat that basically destroys it by saying that the reduction, the most important thing about the reduction is to understand that it can never be completely realized. Whereas for Husserl, the reduction was kind of all important. That was the first step. So yeah, anyway, just kind of a sidetrack about the reduction and the way those two different camps kind of think about it. So Watsuji very, very much falls on the side of Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty. Reduction is useful, but only so we can see our immersion clearly. And then he talks about a destruction in which we trace everyday expressions of Ningen's being back to their source to critically analyze them and eliminate the historical and climatic determinations. So now that we can see ourselves in the world clearly, now we can trace or pick out the things that are essential to that being. And when he says things like historical and climatic, eliminating those determinations, I think we can understand that more broadly in the sense of historical as temporal and climatic as spatial. So just understanding how our existence in time and space has influenced us, and then we can decide from that what is essential to being a human being and what is kind of contingent. And again, just kind of getting rid of preconceived notions we might have based on our upbringing, or the era in which we live, or the linguistic constraints we might be under. All of those things can be analyzed and eliminated. And then the third movement is a construction, and this is the positive movement in which the fundamental structure of Ningen's being is revealed. So those are the three aspects of hermeneutics: reduction, destruction, construction. And that means it must be time for a summary. First, then, we looked at key concepts, and there were 4 of these: in-betweenness, the way that we are fundamentally members of society; act connections, which were the kind of the glue that makes in-betweenness work; ethics, or Rinri, which was concerned with our nature as human beings. It was ethics as it emerges from a deeper understanding of the human being as this in-betweenness, as fundamentally immersed in society. And then Ningen was the 4th key term, which was just human being, but a human being as an individual immersed in society. Both of those aspects kind of being included in the idea of Ningen. And there was a contradiction there, which we will look at a little bit later on. Then we looked at his method, and there were two main ideas here. The first was community. So community is primary, in-betweenness is our starting point, and then practical, the idea of act connections, the way that they are crucial to understanding what it is to be in-betweenness, what it is to live as in-betweenness. And the method of Watsuji's was a hermeneutical one, which he understands as a method which tries to understand something subjective with the aid of expressions which are themselves kind of ill-suited to this task of rendering the subject perfectly clear, of analyzing the subject in a rigorous fashion. So Watsuji was focusing then on the non-thetic, the kind of the way that we act prior to having reflected on something. So the reflection always comes after the act has finished. And this was reflected in his use of the word understanding, which was intensely practical in nature, completely following Heidegger. And the idea that we're starting with everyday relations, our everyday acts. Again, in kind of the opposite approach that Husserl took. Instead of removing those from the beginning, we want to investigate those. We want to use those as our springboard to understand in-betweenness. And there were three aspects to his hermeneutical method: the reduction, to give us a clear understanding or a picture of ourselves as members of society; destruction, where we can, after having reduced ourselves to, or after having performed the reduction so we can see ourselves clearly, we can see what is intrinsic, what is essential to our nature, and get rid of everything else. And then construction, where we where the fundamental structure of what it is to be a human being is finally revealed. And that's that. So in the next video we will turn to part 2 and look at chapters 3, 4 and 5. But that's us for today. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next video.